All right. Good morning. Hey, yesterday, if you guys have been looking at the notes that I posted yesterday for the sermon on Genesis 21, you notice, and I even told you we weren't going to get all the way through those, and I knew there were a lot more notes and then we were going to get done, and so me being very verbose. I knew we weren't going to get through those, so I took you through the first 7 verses. I told you I would post a little video that would have for us some more of the content that you see on the notes that I posted on the blog. And so I'm going to walk through those very briefly with you. But I think even more importantly than the information, the content is the application to those passages or to those verses. That's really key to the rest of the passage. And just a quick cap in chapter 21. It's 34 verses, and we hit verse 1 to 7, where we just really dealt with the faithfulness of the Lord and the goodness of God to be gracious to Abraham, and how he's gracious. He's gracious to us, and we get those glimpses of the gospel and the work of God to be gracious and kind in Christ Jesus for those who walk with Him and trust in Him, and then the tension of walking with the Lord and the reality of trusting that, but knowing that sometimes it takes. It's God's timing. God works in His time, and His time's perfect. And we walk in our little tiny perspective of time. And man, that's hard. And there's tension there. But it's worth waiting on the Lord. And so we talked about that yesterday. But what we see in verse 8, working down through verse 14, a couple of things. Number one, you see the Lord protecting the promise, Isaac, but protecting Abraham and Sarah, particularly in this instance from Ishmael. And the language that is used here is the same word, laughing, that is used of the gift God gave Abraham and Sarah of happiness in the fulfillment of His promise. But in this instance, it's used differently. It's a different kind of laughter. As a matter of fact, the language of the text sort of implies mocking or some type of mockery. As a matter of fact, Paul quotes this passage in the book of Galatians and refers to Ishmael as persecuting Isaac. And so God being gracious and kind to Abraham and Sarah and to Isaac, the promised son, does this very uncomfortable thing that even He tells Abraham, listen to your wife, Sarah. She's going to have you send them away. And He does. He sends them away. And so God protects them. But we also see something here that's it's a little bit hard to swallow. It's a hard truth. And that is built in to Abraham's sin of trying to get God's promises in his way. He has a son that he loves, and he has another wife. And so there's tension between Sarah and Hagar and this son now who is, as Paul says, persecuting the promised son. God gives Abraham a word, and He says, listen to your wife Sarah, send them away. And He sends them away. Now this is super uncomfortable because that doesn't feel like a good solution. It's harsh, it's tough, it's difficult. And I referred to this yesterday, and I'll say this here, and this is important for all of us to get, for me to get, is that sin, when we rebel against God and we don't do what He says, there are no good solutions to that. There's no fixing that. And so the 2 things right here real quickly. Number one, God's going to be gracious and kind to Hagar and Ishmael. God's going to make him a nation, and He provides for them, even though they are sent away. So we see that in God protecting, He's still gracious to Hagar and Ishmael because He is a gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness. So He's going to be good to them. He's going to provide for them. But we see here too this harsh reality that there is just no good solution that's comfortable for sin. And so the application for us here is very clear. Sometimes the consequences of our actions, they're the discipline. And in Christ, He's never going to judge us. God is never going to judge us for our sin. If He judged us for our sin, we would go to hell. But because of Christ and His redemptive work, and we see it here, God doesn't judge Abraham. Abraham reaps the consequences of his actions, but God's still merciful and gracious because his sin is going to be atoned for in Christ. But right here, he reaps the consequences of his actions by having to send away in this very difficult situation his own son. And he sends him away. God's gracious to them, but there's no good solution here. And so this is a reminder for us that even though sin is so easy, and there's this tension in the Christian life where sin feels good. And it sometimes looks like maybe the sinful option is the good option. And sometimes righteousness is so hard, and there's this tension in our heart of we want right, but we want sin too. And sin's so easy to give into because sin is deceptive. Sin promises what it can never deliver on. But what we don't realize is that sin has consequences built into it, and some of those just can't be easily repaired. The illustration that I think of, and it's not the most pleasant illustration, but in the context of warfare, if a person pulls a pin on a hand grenade and it explodes in their hand, that person possibly, likely, not going to live. But if they do live, the consequences of that hand grenade exploding in their hand are going to be devastating and never, ever repaired rightly, because you can't fix that kind of stuff. And here's the thing, sin's like that. We want to play with sin, and sin's like a hand grenade. And if it explodes on us, and it will, because the consequences of sin is death, you just don't repair some of those things very easily. So for us, the application is avoid sin, run to righteousness. So help me. Sin feels good, but here's the deal. Righteousness feels better. And that's the deception of sin. Sin promises what it can never deliver on, that this is good for you, this is better for you, when in fact righteousness is better for us. Righteousness does taste better than sin, but sin is deceptive and sin kills. And sometimes, though, we get God's discipline built into the consequences, and he teaches us through those things. And they're uncomfortable. Just like this situation is uncomfortable. When we sin, it creates discomfort. And as you've heard me say this before, sin never just affects me, though. It always affects other people. Abraham's sin didn't just affect him and Sarah. It affected Hagar and Ishmael. And so never forget that for us. Sin doesn't do any good. It does no one any good. So we run to righteousness. We strive for holiness. Last section here in the passage, verse 22 through 34, God's gracious to restore Abraham. Now, Abraham made the error of telling Abimelech that Sarah's his sister, and Abimelech, the unbelieving king, rebukes Abraham. And here he has an interaction with Abimelech where now Abraham is in the right because of an issue of a well that he dug. And what God has done now in the eyes of Abimelech for Abraham is restore him, because Abimelech recognizes he and his commander, he says actually in verse 22, God is with you in all that you do. And so God exalts Abraham. He restores him because that's what he does for his people. Our sin is atoned for. He's gracious to us. He lifts us up, and he accomplishes his purpose for us. And he's doing that here with Abraham in this passage. As a matter of fact, we come to the end of the passage, and Abimelech and his commander go back to their land. And in response to God's exaltation of him, Abraham plants a tree, and he calls on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God, and he worships. And so a great lesson here for us is for us to always respond to God's grace and worship. Because of the work of Christ for us, the only proper response to that is for us to worship the everlasting God, the God who restores, the God who fixes, the God who pardons our sin. And so Abraham set that pattern for us, and we want to obey that pattern of worshiping the Lord in response to his grace. God restored him. In Christ, God has restored us, and our response is always worship. So Three Rivers, so thankful for what God did in us yesterday as a fellowship in response to his word. So thankful for what God's done in my heart through his word, and thankful that he's working on us and growing us up into the head, who is Christ. And so I hope this little revisiting of the rest of our passage will be of encouragement to you, maybe be instruction to you, help us all to avoid sin this week as we live life together, as we engage our domains, continue to preach the gospel and heal what's broken. Hopefully we will run more to Christ and grow further up into Christ as we learn to hear and obey. And so grace and peace to you. Three Rivers, have a great week. We'll get this posted up and hopefully be a help to you. Take care. See you soon.